I see that we've increased the crowd, which is good. The crowd here in the ecclesia, and of course also the people that we have online. Welcome back. Hope that everyone has had an opportunity to stretch their legs, grab a snack, have some more coffee. Brother Phil has been gracious enough to make sure that I am well caffeinated, because if I am not, things don't go very well. So I hope that we're all ready to go and ready for class number 2, and that we can maintain a little bit of attention, because if we're falling asleep by now, it's for one or two reasons. It's either, it's the topic itself, or your alarm, or maybe you didn't have coffee like I did. Some of us really need coffee the same way that we might need curry. So, and I know that I'm standing in the way of lunch. So, but here we are, God's deliverance. Let's dig into this one. And so, in my view, the link between class 1 and class 2 is quite clear. And what we're going to do in this class is explore specific moments and verses when the reader is being asked to remember specific moments when God delivered his people. And we will see why that is so important and what lessons we can gain from that. And what I think is the most obvious correlation between the last class and this class is that whenever God remembers his covenant, his people are delivered. So that's an easy connection to make. And we saw it in the context of Noah, and we saw it in the context of Abraham, and we saw it in the context of Moses. And we will see very hopefully and very clearly this morning that there are a number of reasons why God commands that we remember his deliverance. And these are the things that were told to the children of Israel, and I think are absolutely worth our study and worth our consideration this morning. For throughout Scripture, God commands his people to remember their deliverance, to strengthen their faith, to prevent fear, to produce obedience, to create gratitude, to teach the next generation, to produce mercy, to guard against pride, and to prevent people from falling away. And those are the reasons that I want you to think about and keep in mind as we explore this second class. Hopefully this works. There we go. And so, basically a summary here of what I mentioned on whenever God remembers his covenant, it should say his people are delivered. We see, when God remembered Noah, the flood waters receded in his household and he's preserved in the ark. Abraham, God remembers Abraham. Lot is delivered out of the destruction of Sodom because, of course, Abraham interceded for Lot. And God remembers his covenant, and Israel is delivered out of bondage in Egypt. So that is a nice little flow chart that shows you where we were specifically in our first class. And so we take a look at Exodus 13, and we see that there is something called the Feast of the Unleavened Bread. And that is being established in verse 3. Verse 3, remember this day. This is what Moses is saying. Remember this day in which ye came out from Egypt, out of the house of bondage. For by strength of hand the Lord brought you out from this place. There shall no leavened bread be eaten. And so that is in Exodus chapter 13, verse 3. Now, the Feast of Unleavened Bread is, for the benefit of those who could use a reminder, is that it follows the Passover, and it lasts 7 days after Passover. And while Passover was created to remember the deliverance, the Feast of Unleavened Bread was to remember their departure from Egypt. And if we want to look at the history behind what unleavened bread has to do with anything here, I think we can go to Exodus 12, verses 39. And in Exodus 12:39, in the context here it says, "And they baked unleavened cakes of the dough, which they brought forth out of Egypt, for it was not leavened, because they were thrust out of Egypt and could not tarry. Neither had they prepared for themselves any victuals." And so they had to bake unleavened bread because they didn't have time to prepare any food for themselves, and they were urgently leaving Egypt. They're being thrust out. And if we go back to verse 33 of that same chapter in Exodus, we go to 33, it says, "The Egyptians were urgent with the people to send them out of the land in haste, for they said, 'We shall all be dead.' So the people took their dough before it was leavened, their kneading bowls being bound up in their cloaks on their shoulders." And so that is why they did what they did. The children of Israel left in haste, and there was no time to wait for the dough to rise. So every year they reenact this, and the command is very clear. It's not simply that they are to eat unleavened bread, but the key command here for them is to remember. The unleavened bread was just the teaching tool by which they are helping them to remember. And so one thing that's very clear about this feast also is that it was meant for the next generation to understand. And if we look at Exodus 13, verses 8, Exodus 13, verses 8 says something very interesting here. And we'll go to verse 7 for connection. It says, "Unleavened bread," and this is in Exodus chapter 13, verse 7, "Unleavened bread shall be eaten 7 days, and there shall no leavened bread be seen with thee, neither shall there be leaven seen with thee in all thy quarters. And thou shalt shew thy son in that day, saying, This is done because of that which the Lord did unto me when I came forth out of Egypt." And we also go to verse 14. It says, and it shall be, if we go to Exodus 13, verse 14, it says, "And it shall be that when thy son asketh thee in time to come, saying, What is this? That thou shalt say unto him, By strength of the hand the Lord brought us out from Egypt, from the house of bondage." And we see various patterns like this throughout the Bible where God commands for certain things to be done, certain feasts, certain sacrifices, certain events. And one of those reasons is for the next generation to be aware. And that's very interesting. And another reason why the children of Israel were commanded to partake in this feast is that it was meant to be a memorial. And if we look in Exodus 13, verses 9, it says, "And it shall be for a sign unto thee upon thine hand, and for a memorial between thine eyes, that the Lord's law may be in thy mouth. For with a strong hand hath the Lord brought thee out of Egypt. Thou shalt therefore keep this ordinance in his season from year to year." And it seems here, God really did not want his people to forget what they had gone through. And I think it's crucial because God knows us. He knows his creation. He knows his people. He knows our nature. After all, he created us. And it was Moses. If you remember Moses, all he had to do was once delay coming down from the mountain, and the children of Israel were already making their own gods, and they were already in revelry and doing X, Y, and Z, and claiming that those were the gods that led them out of Egypt. And so God already knew from experience that these people will quickly forget. God also understood that prosperity in time would likely make Israel forget Egypt. And so the people needed to be reminded from whence they came. They needed to be reminded. And we also need to be reminded from whence we came. And this feast of unleavened bread is a really good example of what it means to remember. Because as I mentioned in the first class, to remember action based on memory, as we talked about in our first class. And God is saying here, every year, I want you to stop, and I want you to remember what you were, what I did, how I delivered you, who you are now. And you're going to be remembering, which is an action. And the tool that is being used to aid is that they're going to eat unleavened bread. And you even have to remove leaven from the entire household for a complete period. That is what God wanted his people to see and do and experience. And now, besides the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is the picture-perfect example of the children of Israel being commanded to remember God's deliverance, there are also other verses that are connected to the children of Israel being delivered out of the land of Egypt, where the people are constantly being told that they are to remember God's deliverance. And these two verses that we're going to read in connection are in the context of fear. Remember, I said that one of the reasons to remember God's deliverance is to reduce fear. And when we say fear, what do we mean when we say fear? Now, I will propose to you that there are two types of fear. There is the right fear and there's the wrong fear. And what is the right fear, brothers and sisters and friends? The right fear is to fear God. And that is the right fear. The wrong fear is to fear men, to fear the nations around you, or in the context of the children of Israel, for them to fear the nations around them. And God, especially at this time that this book was written, was very concerned about the heart of Israel and their propensity to be fearful and to fear the nations around them. And as you will see, it's clear that the solution that God provides, the antidote that God provides for fear, is to remember the Lord your God. And if we look in verse 17 in Deuteronomy verse 7, which is right here, it says, "If thou shalt say in thine heart, these nations are more than I, how can I dispossess them? Thou shalt not be afraid of them, but shalt well remember what the Lord thy God did unto Pharaoh and unto all Egypt. The great temptations which thine eyes saw, and the signs and the wonders and the mighty hand and the stretched out arm whereby the Lord thy God brought thee out, so shall the Lord thy God do unto all the people of whom thou art afraid." So God said, you have nothing to fear. Remember what I have done for you in the past, how I have delivered you in the past, and I will continue to deliver you in the present, onto this day. And so that is one of the things, that this would resist fear, and that there is a right fear and that there is a wrong fear. So it is that deliverance from God and remembering that deliverance to make sure that his people are not fearing the wrong things. One of the other things that I mentioned earlier in this session was pride. And that was another state of the heart issue that God was worried about for the children of Israel. And if we look at chapter 8 of Deuteronomy, that is a defining chapter when it comes to remembering, because there's a key word in there. It's used alongside the word forget. And in some Bibles, especially the ones that have subheadings, you'll notice that that chapter has remember the Lord your God. Some people may have remember the Lord your God. But, we're focused on pride as one of the issues or states of the heart that God was also concerned about. And we see here in chapter 8, starting at verse 17, it says, "And thou say in thine heart, my power and the might of mine hand hath gotten me this wealth. But thou shalt remember the Lord thy God, for it is he that giveth thee power to get wealth, that he may establish his covenant, which he sware unto thy fathers, as it is this day. And this was said as God reminded them about everything that they went through in the wilderness and how they suffered. And then another major theme that is important to consider that comes out of chapter 8 of Deuteronomy is this notion of obedience. And you can imagine deliverance and obedience are very connected. And remembering all the things that happened in the wilderness is demonstrated in obedience. And it was meant to test the heart, everything that they experienced in the wilderness. And you may note this desire that God had for Israel's heart to produce evidence of obedience. That's why they were in the wilderness. For if you look at verse 2 of that chapter 8, it says, "And thou shalt remember all the way which the Lord thy God had led thee this 40 years in the wilderness, to humble thee and to prove thee, to know what was in thine heart, whether thou wouldest keep his commandments or no." And if that lesson is learned, such as that lesson from the test that took place in the wilderness, then future obedience and being ready for the next trial is very much possible. But if these things are forgotten, as with the children of Israel and even with us, very well happens, it opens the door to the things that shouldn't happen, idolatry. It opens the door for disobedience. And these are the things that we've seen with the children of Israel and that we see even onto today with ourselves. And then we also have the issue of disobedience in action. And we see the result of of people forgetting God's deliverance rather than remembering it. And you may recall in Judges chapter 2, and some of you may have this subheading as well, it's entitled Israel's Disobedience. And in that chapter, if you remember, the angel of the Lord went from Gilgal to Bochim, and he said, "I brought you up from Egypt, and brought you into the land that I swore to give to your fathers. I said, I will never break my covenant with you, and you shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of this land." So God reminds them who brought them out. He is the one who delivered them from Egypt and brought them into the land that he swore to their fathers, and that he would never break his covenant. But the people, regardless of that, were disobedient. They didn't break down the altars that God commanded them to destroy. And because of this, what did God do? In verse 3 it says, "Wherefore I also said, I will not drive them out from before you, but they shall be as thorns in your sides, as their God shall be a snare unto you." This was the consequence of disobedience for the children of Israel. And there's something else, brothers, sisters, and friends and visitors, that's said in this chapter that I think is very, very notable that we should be mindful of and we should take a close look at. And it happens in verse 10. And this is where you get all the things that happened immediately after Joshua had died. And we, of course, know of Joshua's faithfulness towards God. And there is this comparison that I would like you to see. And if you come with me to verse 7, it says, "And the people served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders that outlived Joshua, who had seen all the great works of the Lord that he did for Israel." So we see things were fine when Joshua was alive, and all the elders that outlived Joshua, they had seen all the great works of God that he did for Israel. And we see that everything was fine. And I want you to hone in on the word seen. Because if we look at the Hebrew, it means something more than just seeing. It means something more. It means something more than just looking. I mean, it means to observe, to perceive, to experience, to understand through first-hand encounter. It means to witness something personally and to understand its significance. But yet, we go to verse 10 of that same chapter, and there's a stark contrast in the description of the following generation. And it says, there arose another generation after them, which knew not the Lord, nor yet the works that he had done for Israel. And we see that in the following verses, that the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. They served Baal. They abandoned God. They abandoned the God of their fathers who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. And so look at that stark contrast between one generation and the other. And I think that's very notable. It's very interesting. One that remembered God's deliverance and one generation that forgot. Generation one, the generation that saw the works of God, remembered it, remembered his deliverance, that was the generation that had served God. And then the other generation that came after, they did not know God's works and deliverance. They did not remember it. They turned to other gods. And that is why, if you go to Psalm 78, verses 4, it says, we will not hide them from their children, shewing to the generation to come the praises of the Lord and his strength and his wonderful works that he had done. And then verse 7 says, that they may set their hope in God and not forget the works of God, but keep his commandments. So it's very interesting, and I think it's a lesson not only for, of course, it was a lesson for the children of Israel, but you can imagine that the generation that came after the generation of Joshua and the elders must have been younger. So if you will, think about the elders, those who saw the work of God, remembered his covenant, remembered his deliverance, and that led to them serving the Lord. Generation 2, the ones who are just coming up, they don't know his works, they did not remember. But the key here is that they forgot his deliverance. They should know. They may not have necessarily been there, they may not have personally experienced it, but they should know because they had their fathers and they had those who served the Lord. But somehow they find themselves serving other gods. And so what I see is a very sobering message to us in relation to young people and children in our midst and in relation to the next generation in terms of the youth. For what we've studied also this morning is what happens between one generation and the next. And one generation can be faithful, and yet the one that comes after can completely forget God and move in a different direction. That is a legitimate fear and concern that we should have. And we want to make sure that those who are young and those children and young people in our midst can say that they have heard and have known what they were taught by their fathers and their mothers. That they came to a knowledge and an understanding of the strengths and the wonderful works that he, God, has done, that they might keep the commandments of God. And I would contend that we all have examples that we can share to young people and to our children, and of our own personal trials, so that young people can not only know what deliverance sounds like in theory, but they can know what it looks like in action. And so that they may be able to say, I know of God's deliverance, how he always keeps his commandments because my father told me, or a brother or sister in the ecclesia told me their experience. And that is one of the ways that we can help to protect the next generation. We know that God's deliverance remembering God's deliverance protects us. And that is one of and it protects us from falling away. And those are the examples that we can share of God's deliverance. And while we have a number of examples for the purpose of remembering God's deliverance, one of the main purposes of remembering God's deliverance, as we covered, is to produce faith. And we've seen it because we've seen that where faith exists when it is remembered, and we see where faith does not exist when it is not remembered. And if we go back to Deuteronomy 7, verses 18 and 19, we saw that when the children of Israel were so afraid, they were so afraid of their enemies around them. And God said, remember Pharaoh, remember the signs and the wonders, remember how I got you out of that predicament. And what it was is it was a lack of faith on behalf of the children of Israel. And that is why God was so angry with them when, they sent out spies and they said, we can't handle these people. These people they look like giants compared to us, and we look like, butterflies or caterpillars. And so that's the problem. Remembering God's deliverance in a positive note produces gratitude. Psalm 103 verses 2 says, "Bless the Lord, O my soul, and forget not all his benefits." And this heart is very, very important. God is very much concerned, as I'm sure we know and we've read about, God is very concerned about the state of the heart. He, of course, was very concerned about the state of the heart of the children of Israel. And more likely than not, a grateful heart is a remembering heart. Think about that. A grateful heart is a remembering heart. And in contrast, a complaining heart tends to be a forgetting heart. And interesting how that works. And then also, one of the key things that we've emphasized throughout this class is the role of obedience that all of this plays. The role of obedience that all of this plays. And that, if we go back to Deuteronomy verses 1 and 2, all of the commandments, it says in Deuteronomy chapter 8 in verse 1 and 2, it says, "All the commandments which I commanded thee this day shall ye observe to do, that ye may live and multiply and go in and possess the land which the Lord sware unto your fathers. And you shall remember all the way which the Lord thy God had led thee these 40 years in the wilderness, to humble thee, to prove thee, to know what was in thine heart, whether thou wouldst keep his commandments or no." Israel was to remember God's guidance, God's provision, and God's discipline, so that they as in the children of Israel, would walk faithfully. Let me go back, because we're not on this class yet. We're still talking about this. And we should remember that remembering God's deliverance will protect us. As I mentioned, it will protect us from falling away. It will protect us from our unbelief. We read in Psalms 106, verses 13, referring to the children of Israel, it says, "They soon forgot his works. They waited not for his counsel, but lusted exceedingly in the wilderness, and tempted God in the desert." And that is an incredible thing. We have the tale of the two generations. We have the generation that remembered and the generation that didn't. And what I wonder is, what may have happened? What was the disconnect? We know that generation 2 forgot his deliverance, but we just know, and we tend to see this pattern where there's a generation that knows the Lord, and then there's a generation that doesn't. Kind of like, you may remember that there were a king that remembered God, and then there were kings that did not remember God. And we see this over and over again. And we always know that when we see that a king remembers God, and when I mean kings, I mean the kings are the judges of the children of Israel. Whenever they remember, they do good in the sight of the Lord. Whenever they don't remember, they do evil in the sight of the Lord. So think about that as well, as we close. And when we return from lunch, we'll look at class 3, which is Remember God's Warnings.